Before the world had borders, before empires carved their names into stone, there was a city born without certainty, only will. From a quiet bend in a river, on 7 unremarkable hills, Rome emerged. Not powerful, not prepared, but relentless. A settlement shaped by struggle, hardened by discipline, and bound by a belief that order could rise from chaos. And once it began to grow, nothing could stop it. The world began to take shape around Rome. Stone towers rose from dust. Torchlight flickered against marble. Steel rang faintly through narrow streets. Laws were written, roads were laid. Legions marched not only to conquer land, but to impose meaning upon it. This is the story of a civilization that did not merely rule the world. It defined it. Here, pride built empires, patience forged law, and ordinary lives unfolded beneath extraordinary power, in the shadow of an empire that believed itself eternal. As you walk these streets at dusk, what reaches you first? The warmth of firelight on stone, the rhythm of marching feet, or the hush of a city that knows it will be remembered? Tell us in the comments where you're listening from, and if you love epic stories of the past told with depth and care. Gently tap like and subscribe, and settle in. Now dim your screen, let the air grow still, and return with us to a time before Rome knew what it would become. Long before Rome became a name spoken across continents, the land itself was quiet and undecided. The Italian peninsula stretched gently into the Mediterranean, its hills softened by grass and olive trees, its rivers winding without urgency toward the sea. Morning mist clung to valleys, evenings settled slowly with the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. This was a place not yet shaped by marble or law, but by rhythm, of seasons, of footsteps, of stories whispered beside small fires. People had lived here for generations beyond counting. Farmers rose with the sun, turning soil with patient hands. Shepherds guided their flocks across hills worn smooth by centuries of hooves. Small villages clustered near water, where life felt safer, more certain. There were no grand borders, only familiar paths. No empire, only memory. And yet, even in this calm, stories were already forming. Romans would later say their city began not with bricks, but with a legend. Twin brothers, born of divine blood and mortal danger, set adrift on a river swollen with spring rain. A basket caught among reeds, a she-wolf, fierce yet gentle, offering warmth instead of hunger. These images endured, not because they were factual, but because they felt true. They spoke of survival against odds, of strength found in unlikely places, of destiny waiting quietly until it is ready to be claimed. Romulus and Remus were more than names. They were a way of explaining why this city believed it had been chosen, not spared from hardship, but shaped by it. As the tale goes, the brothers grew, quarreled, and stood upon separate hills. In that moment, Rome's deepest theme appeared for the first time: unity strained by rivalry. When Romulus stood alone, marking the sacred boundary of a new city, the soil itself seemed to accept the line. A beginning had been declared, paid for with blood and grief, as so many beginnings would be. But history does not rest on myth alone. Beneath the legends, real people were laying stones, digging ditches, and shaping a settlement beside the Tiber River. The river mattered. It was shallow enough to cross, deep enough to trade upon. It connected inland villages to distant coasts. It brought travelers, merchants, and news, slow at first, but steady. Rome began as a crossing point. The hills around it offered protection. The land nearby could be farmed, salt could be traded. These were small advantages, but Rome would always be a city that grew by collecting small advantages and refusing to let them go. In its earliest days, Rome was ruled by kings, not emperors, not tyrants carved in stone, but leaders who embodied both authority and ritual. The king was a judge, a general, a priest. He listened to omens. He honored the gods. He led men to war when war could not be avoided. 7 kings, tradition later claimed, each one shaping the city in quiet but lasting ways. Streets were laid out. Walls were raised. Temples were built not for splendor, but for reassurance. The people needed to believe the gods were near, attentive, willing to listen. Among these early influences, none loomed larger than the Etruscans, a powerful civilization to the north. They brought skills Rome did not yet possess: engineering, architecture, symbols of authority. From them came the knowledge to drain marshes, to carve stone, to imagine a city not just as shelter, but as permanence. Under their influence, Rome grew more confident. Public spaces appeared. Ritual became organized. Power began to look impressive. And yet, with that growth came discomfort. Kings ruled for life. Their authority, though wrapped in custom, rested on obedience. As Rome expanded, its people changed. Farmers became soldiers. Villagers became citizens. They began to ask questions that had no easy answers. Who decides? Who benefits? Who is protected? And who is not? The final king, remembered as proud and cruel, became a warning etched into memory. His fall was not simply a political shift. It was a lesson learned too deeply to forget. Never again, the Romans would later insist. Would they allow one man to hold unchecked power? The monarchy ended not with silence, but with resolve. Rome was now a city that defined itself by what it rejected. No more kings, no more crowns. Power would be divided, shared, limited by law and tradition. The memory of early rule would not vanish, but it would harden into caution. Yet even as Rome stepped into a new political identity, the past lingered everywhere, in ceremonies that mirrored royal rituals, in sacred boundaries that could not be crossed without consequence, in the deep respect given to ancestors, whose imagined presence watched from every household shrine. Rome did not erase its beginnings, it carried them, and perhaps that was its greatest strength, because Rome was never just a place. It was an idea forming slowly. That order could be built from conflict, that tradition could restrain ambition, that community could outlast individuals. These beliefs did not emerge fully formed. They were tested, bent, and sometimes broken. But they took root early, in the age before empire, when the city was still small enough to feel the weight of each decision. As night fell over early Rome, lamps flickered in simple homes. The sound of the river moved steadily in the darkness. Somewhere, a storyteller repeated the old tales, not as entertainment, but as instruction. Children listened, learning who they were meant to be. Rome was still fragile, still uncertain, still unaware of how far its influence would stretch. But its foundations, myth and memory, fear and ambition, ritual and resistance, were already set deep into the soil. And from those quiet beginnings, Something vast was waiting to rise. The fall of Rome's kings did not come with celebration alone. It arrived with caution, with memory still fresh and trust not easily given. The people had driven out their last ruler, but what remained was uncertainty, a question hanging quietly in the air like smoke after a fire. If no one man would rule, then how would Rome be governed at all? The answer emerged slowly, shaped by fear as much as hope. Rome became a republic not in a single moment, but through careful division. Power was broken apart, scattered across offices, rituals, and expectations. No single voice would command the city for long. Authority would rotate. Decisions would be shared. Responsibility would be heavy but temporary. At the center of this new system stood the consuls, 2 men elected each year to lead the state together. Each could restrain the other. Neither could rule alone. Their authority was immense, but fleeting, lasting only long enough to serve, never long enough to dominate. This rhythm of rotation became sacred. Time itself became a safeguard. Beneath the consuls sat the Senate, a body of elders whose influence rested not on force, but on tradition. These men came from Rome's oldest families. They had inherited not only wealth, but memory, stories of famine, war, and survival. The Senate advised, debated, and shaped policy, often quietly, often behind closed doors. It was not democratic in the modern sense, but it valued continuity above impulse. For ordinary Romans, life changed little at first. Fields still needed tending. Markets still opened at dawn. Children still learned their letters and their prayers. But something subtle had shifted. Authority now felt distant, impersonal, governed by rules rather than moods. Law began to matter more than lineage. And when laws were written down, carved into public view, it was a revolution in itself. The 12 tables, displayed where all could see them, promised fairness through visibility. No longer could customs be bent in secret. Justice, at least in theory, belonged to everyone. Yet the Republic was never equal. Rome was divided between patricians and plebeians, the powerful and the many. Patricians held most offices. They controlled land, religion, and interpretation of the law. Plebeians worked the fields, served in the army, built the city with their hands. They paid the price of war, but rarely reaped its rewards. Tensions simmered quietly, then loudly. At times, plebeians withdrew from the city altogether, refusing to work or fight until their voices were heard. These peaceful revolts forced compromise. New offices were created. Tribunes were appointed to protect common citizens, armed not with swords, but with the power to say no, to veto decisions that harmed the people. This balance was fragile. It depended on restraint, on shared belief in the system itself. When leaders respected the Republic, it functioned. When ambition grew impatient, cracks appeared. Still, for centuries, Rome endured. War shaped the Republic as much as law. Every citizen was also a soldier, expected to defend the city when called. Military service was not a profession, but a duty, one that bound men to the state and to one another. Victories brought land, prestige, and confidence. Defeats brought humility and reform. Rome learned from failure. After early disasters, it adapted its army, its tactics, its discipline. Flexibility became a habit. Where others clung to tradition, Rome adjusted. Where others broke, Rome bent. Conquest followed. Nearby cities were absorbed, not erased. Rome offered alliances, shared citizenship, and protection on its own terms. Roads stretched outward, carrying troops, traders, and ideas. Each victory made the Republic stronger, but also heavier, burdened with new responsibilities and new inequalities. At home, the city grew crowded. Wealth from conquest flowed unevenly. Great estates replaced small farms. Veterans returned to find their land gone, their families displaced. The heart of the Republic, the independent farmer-soldier, began to weaken. Yet rituals continued. Elections were held. Laws were passed. The appearance of balance remained intact, even as strain built beneath the surface. Romans believed deeply in virtue, in self-control, duty, and service to the state. These ideals were taught in stories, honored in funerals, carved into memory. A man's worth was measured not only by success, but by restraint. To seek power openly was shameful. To serve quietly was praised. But ideals are most tested when success is abundant. As Rome expanded, opportunities for glory multiplied. Generals returned from campaigns celebrated as heroes. Their names were remembered. Their soldiers were loyal, sometimes more loyal to their commander than to the Republic itself. The system had been designed for a city. It was now governing a growing power. Still, in these early centuries, the Republic held. Not because it was perfect, but because Romans believed in it fiercely. They feared kings. They honored tradition. They trusted that law, once established, could outlast any individual. At night, the city settled into familiar rhythms. Voices echoed in narrow streets. Oil lamps flickered against stone walls. Somewhere, a magistrate prepared speeches for the morning. Somewhere else, a farmer sharpened tools before dawn. Rome was no longer young, but it was not yet restless. The Republic stood balanced between past and future, grounded in memory, reaching unknowingly toward empire. And for now, that balance, however strained, was enough. But time, patient and unyielding, was already testing the limits of power without kings. War did not arrive in Rome as an interruption. It was a condition of growth, woven quietly into daily life, accepted with a steadiness that bordered on reverence. To be Roman was to be prepared, to leave the plough behind when summoned, to lift shield and spear, not for glory alone, but for survival. In the early Republic, Rome was still surrounded by rivals. Hill towns watched one another carefully. Alliances shifted like weather. Conflict flared, settled, then returned. No border felt permanent. No peace felt final. Rome learned early that strength was not enough. Endurance mattered more. Its armies were not yet the unstoppable legions of later centuries. They were citizen soldiers, farmers and craftsmen who trained in seasons between harvests. They marched with heavy packs, slept on open ground, and learned discipline not through punishment alone, but through shared hardship. Each man depended on the one beside him. Order kept them alive. When Rome fought neighbouring Latin cities, then the Sabines, then the Etruscans, it did not always win easily. There were defeats sharp enough to sting memory. There were moments when retreat felt uncomfortably close to ruin. But Rome responded not with despair, but with adjustment. Formations changed. Commands became clearer. Authority was respected, not because it was feared, but because it worked. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Rome's presence expanded. What set Rome apart was not simply conquest, but incorporation. Defeated enemies were not always crushed. Many were absorbed, granted partial rights, protected status, paths towards citizenship. Roads were built not just to move armies, but to bind territories together. Stone by stone, mile by mile, the Italian peninsula began to feel connected. Each road told the same story. Rome is here, and Rome intends to stay. As Rome consolidated Italy, new challenges emerged beyond the peninsula. Across the sea lay powers older, richer, and more experienced in war. The Mediterranean was not empty water. It was a crowded world of traders, fleets, and fortified cities. When Rome's interests collided with Carthage, a maritime empire built on commerce and control of trade routes, the scale of war changed forever. The Punic Wars were not quick conflicts. They unfolded across decades, across land and sea, across generations who grew up knowing nothing but tension. Rome, inexperienced at naval warfare, suffered humiliating losses at first. Ships sank. Men drowned. Confidence wavered. But Rome adapted. It copied enemy ship designs, invented new boarding tactics, turned sea battles into something resembling land combat, where Roman discipline could assert itself. Losses were absorbed, fleets rebuilt, resolve hardened. The war became a test of endurance rather than brilliance. When Hannibal crossed the Alps, leading his army through snow and stone into Italy itself, fear entered Rome in a way it had never known. Entire legions were destroyed. Names of battles were spoken softly, like wounds not yet healed. The city prepared for siege, for annihilation. But Rome did not surrender. Instead, it endured, retreating when needed, refusing decisive engagement, wearing the enemy down through time and distance. The cost was enormous. Families grieved. Fields went untended. The strain pressed into every corner of Roman life. Victory, when it finally came, felt less like triumph and more like survival earned. With Carthage broken, Rome stood unchallenged in the Western Mediterranean. But power attracts resistance. Greece, Asia Minor, and distant kingdoms soon felt Rome's presence. Wars followed, some framed as defense, others as obligation, still others as opportunity. Rome told itself it was maintaining order. At home, the consequences of conquest accumulated. Spoils of war flowed into the city: gold, silver, art, slaves. Temples were decorated. Public games grew more lavish. Rome began to look different, richer, louder, more confident. But this wealth did not spread evenly. Small farmers struggled as long absences left their land neglected. Enslaved labour replaced free hands. Estates expanded while independence shrank. Soldiers returned victorious but displaced, honoured yet uncertain of their place. The army itself changed. Service became longer. Campaigns stretched farther from home. Loyalty shifted subtly from the Republic to the generals who led men through danger and rewarded them afterward. Commanders learned the power of personal allegiance. Soldiers learned whose name to remember. Still, the Republic persisted. Assemblies met. Elections were held. Senators debated policy beneath painted ceilings. Rome told itself that tradition was enough to hold everything together. That virtue would restrain ambition. That success would not corrode restraint. And for a time, this belief was justified. Rome stood astride the Mediterranean, not as a monarch's realm, but as a republic of laws and offices. Its dominance seemed almost accidental, the result of necessity, not desire. A city that fought because it had to, conquered because it could not afford not to. Yet beneath this narrative lay an uncomfortable truth. Rome was becoming something larger than the system designed to govern it. Every victory added weight. Every province added complexity. Decisions made in distant camps shaped lives thousands of miles away. Power flowed outward faster than accountability could follow. At dusk, as the city settled, veterans gathered in forums and streets, sharing memories of far-off lands, dry plains, foreign cities, unfamiliar skies. Merchants unloaded goods from across the sea. Senators calculated alliances and risks. The Republic felt vast, busy, strained. Rome had conquered Italy. It had mastered the Mediterranean. It had proven its resilience beyond doubt. What it had not yet learned was how to rule abundance without losing balance. The sword had forged Rome into a power unlike any before it. Whether the hand holding that sword could remain steady was a question the future would soon demand an answer to. For now, Rome marched forward, disciplined, confident, and unaware that the greatest battles ahead would not be fought against foreign enemies, but within itself. Victory changed Rome in ways no enemy ever could. The wars that had carried Roman legions across Italy and beyond returned not only with honor, but with abundance. Ships arrived heavy with grain, metals, fine cloth, and countless human captives. Gold passed from hand to hand. Marble replaced wood. The city grew brighter, louder, more crowded with opportunity. Yet beneath the shine, imbalance spread quietly. Wealth gathered in certain houses and never quite left them again. Great families expanded their estates, buying land from struggling farmers or absorbing it through debt. Fields that had once been tended by free citizens were now worked by enslaved laborers. People taken from conquered lands, stripped of name and future, bound to lives of relentless work. Slavery was not new to Rome, but its scale transformed society. Enslaved people filled kitchens, workshops, farms and mines. Their labor made luxury affordable and wealth effortless for the elite. The Republic benefited but unevenly, and the cost was borne by those who had no voice. Small farmers felt the change most sharply. Years of military service had kept them from their land. When they returned, many found their farms ruined or sold. Without property, they lost not only livelihood, but political standing. Rome's system had been built on the citizen farmer. That foundation was now eroding. The city swelled with displaced men and families seeking work. Tenements rose hastily, stacked high and unsafe. Streets grew crowded. Competition sharpened. The promise of the Republic felt distant to those struggling to survive within it. Still, public life continued. The Senate debated policy. Magistrates presided over courts. Festivals filled the calendar with color and sound. To many, Rome appeared more powerful than ever. But power had begun to distort purpose. Decisions increasingly served wealth rather than balance, expansion rather than stability. Tension between classes deepened. The plebeians had won protections over generations, but those safeguards strained under new pressures. Laws could be delayed. Assemblies could be influenced. Votes could be swayed by gifts, promises, or intimidation. The machinery of the Republic still turned, but it no longer moved evenly. Reformers emerged, often reluctantly, drawn forward by necessity rather than ambition. They spoke of land redistribution, debt relief, and fairness, not as radical ideals, but as attempts to restore an older balance. They reminded Rome of what it claimed to be. Their words found support among the poor and resistance among the powerful. When proposals threatened wealth, they were blocked. When voices grew louder, they were silenced. The Republic had always valued order, and now order was used as justification for inaction. Stability became a shield for privilege. Violence crept in slowly, then suddenly. Political disagreements, once settled by debate, began to spill into the streets. Mobs gathered. Rival factions clashed. Blood stained the stones of the city in places meant for speech and ceremony. Each incident was explained as exceptional. Each one made the next more likely. Meanwhile, the army continued to evolve. Service grew longer and more distant. Soldiers spent years under the command of generals who paid them, rewarded them, and promised them land. Loyalty followed familiarity. The Republic, abstract and distant, could not compete with the man who stood beside them in battle. Commanders understood this. Some embraced it cautiously. Others recognized its potential fully. The old Roman ideal, that the army served the state, not individuals, weakened with every campaign. It did not vanish overnight. It simply loosened, thread by thread. In daily life, contrasts sharpened. Villas expanded along the countryside, adorned with art taken from conquered cities. Inside Rome, public entertainments grew grander, meant to distract and unify. Bread was distributed, games were held. The people were fed and amused, but rarely empowered. Religion, too, adapted to prosperity. Temples grew more ornate. Rituals became more frequent. The gods were thanked for success, even as inequality widened. Faith remained sincere, but increasingly intertwined with display. At night, the city told two stories at once. In the homes of the wealthy, lamps illuminated mosaics and painted walls. Conversations turned to politics, philosophy, and strategy. In crowded apartments, families shared sparse meals, speaking of rumors, grievances, and hopes deferred. Both groups called themselves Roman. Both believed in the Republic, yet their experiences no longer aligned. The cracks were not yet fractures. The structure still stood. But stress was visible to those willing to see it. Rome had conquered the world outside its walls, but it had not yet learned how to manage the world it had created within. Wealth had accelerated everything. Ambition, fear, competition, inequality. Slavery had made labor invisible. Success had made restraint harder to defend. The Republic had been forged in scarcity and threat. Now it lived in abundance and tension. As dawn broke over the city, the markets opened as always. Senators walked to their meetings. Soldiers prepared for distant campaigns. Life continued, busy and purposeful. But the balance that once defined Rome was slipping, slowly, quietly, and the price of ignoring that shift would soon demand to be paid. The Republic stood at a crossroads, though few recognized it yet. One path led toward reform and renewal. The other toward confrontation and concentration of power. Rome had always chosen endurance. Soon, it would be forced to choose transformation. The problems of the Republic were no longer distant murmurs. By the 2nd century, before Rome's empire had even reached its height, tension had settled into the city like a constant weight. Wealth had accumulated, power had narrowed, and for many Romans, the promise of shared rule felt like a memory fading with each passing year. Yet Rome was not a city without conscience. Voices rose calling for reform, not revolution, but restoration. They spoke of the old balance, when land ownership anchored citizenship and service to the state bound rich and poor together. They argued that the Republic could survive only if it remembered what had made it strong in the first place. The first of these voices came from men of privilege who chose to challenge privilege itself. They proposed limits on land holdings, redistribution to dispossessed citizens, and renewed respect for the common good. Their ideas were not radical by modern standards, but in Rome they struck at the heart of elite power. Resistance was immediate. The Senate stalled, delayed, and obstructed. Laws were questioned on technical grounds. Assemblies were disrupted. The language of legality was used to preserve inequality. What could not be defeated through debate was met with intimidation. When persuasion failed, violence followed. The killing of a reformer in broad daylight shattered a boundary Rome had long respected. Political murder, once unthinkable, became a grim possibility. The city absorbed the shock, justified the act, and moved on. But something essential had been lost. If a Roman citizen could be killed for proposing a law, then the law itself was no longer sacred. Fear spread quietly through public life. Future reformers armed themselves with supporters. Opponents gathered their own factions. The Forum, once a place of persuasion, became a stage for confrontation. Each side claimed to act in defense of the Republic, even as their actions weakened it. Beyond the city, another shift unfolded. Rome's armies were no longer seasonal forces. They were professionalized by necessity, serving longer terms in distant lands. Soldiers depended on their commanders for pay, protection, and promises of land after service. Generals became patrons, and armies became instruments of personal influence. This transformation was not planned. It was tolerated. When unrest broke out in Italy among Rome's allies, communities that had fought and bled alongside Roman legions without enjoying full citizenship, the response was hesitant and harsh. These allies demanded recognition, rights, and inclusion. When denied, they rebelled. The social war tore through Italy, pitting Rome against those who had once been its foundation. The fighting was brutal, costly, and deeply unsettling. In the end, Rome granted citizenship, not out of generosity, but necessity. Unity was preserved, but trust had been damaged. Power continued to consolidate in the hands of those who could command loyalty and force. Ambitious leaders learned the lesson quickly. Popular support mattered. Military backing mattered more. Legal boundaries were tested, then crossed. Precedents once unbreakable were reinterpreted, then ignored. One general marched his army on Rome itself, an act previously unthinkable. The city fell silent, stunned by the realization that its greatest threat now came from within. This march shattered another taboo. Once crossed, such a line could never be fully restored. Proscriptions followed, lists of enemies condemned without trial. Property was seized. Fear ruled quietly. Order was claimed, but at a terrible cost. The Republic survived in form, but its spirit was badly wounded. Between moments of open conflict, Rome tried to breathe. Elections continued. Laws were passed. The Senate resumed its debates. Yet nothing felt stable. Everyone knew that power now rested where force could be applied. The balance of offices, once designed to prevent domination, now served as tools to legitimize it. The people, weary and uncertain, looked for protection more than participation. Stability became more valuable than liberty. Leaders who promised peace, even through authority, gained support. The road to civil war was not a single path, but many intersecting ones, paved with fear, ambition, and unresolved injustice. Each compromise delayed collapse while making it more severe when it arrived. Rome had always prided itself on adaptability, but now adaptation had become erosion. At night, the city no longer rested easily. Whispers travelled faster than news. Alliances shifted behind closed doors. Men slept lightly, aware that tomorrow's politics could become tomorrow's violence. The Republic stood strained between reform and control, between memory and necessity. The old safeguards had been tested and found wanting. New solutions, once unimaginable, now felt inevitable. Rome was approaching a moment when it would have to choose between the ideal of shared power and the reality of command. The age of quiet compromise was ending. Ahead lay figures who would promise order, greatness, and renewal, and who would reshape Rome forever. The Republic had survived kings. It had conquered the world. Now it faced its most dangerous challenge yet, itself. By the time Julius Caesar emerged as Rome's most compelling figure, the Republic was already exhausted. Its institutions still stood, but they no longer commanded unquestioned loyalty. Laws existed, yet precedent had been bent so often that certainty felt fragile. What Rome now responded to most readily was confidence, the promise that someone, at last, could bring clarity. Caesar understood this instinctively. He was not born the most powerful man in Rome, nor the richest, nor the most respected. What he possessed was a rare combination of patience and daring. He knew when to wait, when to charm, and when to act decisively. He presented himself not as a destroyer of tradition, but as its heir, a man restoring dignity to a republic that had lost its way. His rise was gradual, deliberate. Through alliances, reforms, and military command, he gathered influence without appearing to seize it. In Gaul, his campaigns brought immense wealth and unmatched loyalty from his soldiers. His victories were reported in Rome as both achievements and warnings. He was becoming indispensable and dangerous. When the Senate demanded that Caesar relinquish his command and return as a private citizen, the moment crystallized. To comply would mean political ruin. To refuse would mean civil war. Caesar paused only briefly before crossing the Rubicon, leading his army into Italy. The act was simple. Its consequences were not. Rome did not erupt immediately. Instead, it fell into a tense stillness, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Pompey and the Senate fled. Authority dissolved almost without resistance. Caesar entered Rome not as a conqueror, but as a man claiming necessity. Civil war spread across the Mediterranean, but it was swift and decisive. Caesar's combination of speed, mercy, and calculation outmatched his rivals. He forgave enemies when it suited him, punished resistance when it did not. By the time the fighting ended, there was no serious opposition left. Rome stood at a crossroads once again. Caesar accepted honours reluctantly, then readily. Dictator for life, Pontifex Maximus, reformer of the calendar, patron of the people, his roles multiplied. He enacted reforms that addressed long-standing grievances: debt relief, land redistribution, expansion of citizenship. To many, he seemed to be doing what the Republic could not. To others, he looked like a king in all but name. The Senate watched uneasily as symbols of monarchy crept back into public life. Statues rose, titles accumulated. Power, once fragmented by design, now flowed toward a single figure. Even those who admired Caesar feared what his success represented. On the Ides of March, that fear turned into action. In a quiet moment within the Senate House, Caesar was surrounded and killed by men who claimed to act in defense of liberty. Their blades struck not only a man, but an illusion, the belief that Rome could simply return to what it had been. The aftermath was chaos. The conspirators had no plan beyond removal. The people mourned. Soldiers waited. The Republic, already weakened, could not absorb the shock. Power rushed to fill the vacuum, faster and more violently than before. Civil war returned, this time among men shaped by Caesar's legacy. Out of this struggle emerged a quieter figure, Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian. Young, careful, and underestimated, he presented himself as restorer rather than ruler. He spoke the language of tradition while mastering the tools of power. Through alliances and betrayals, victories, and calculated restraint, Octavian outlasted his rivals. When the final conflict ended, Rome was exhausted beyond resistance. Peace was no longer an ideal. It was a longing. Octavian understood this better than anyone. He did not abolish the Republic. He preserved its appearance. The Senate still met. Magistrates still served. Laws were still passed. But beneath these forms, authority rested firmly in his hands. He controlled the army, the treasury, and the provinces that mattered most. When the Senate granted him the title Augustus, it was framed as honor, not domination. The word itself suggested reverence without rule. Augustus accepted it carefully, presenting himself as first among equals, not a king. Rome accepted the arrangement gratefully. The empire was born not in a declaration, but in a compromise between memory and necessity. Romans told themselves that the Republic lived on, transformed but intact. In truth, power had been reshaped permanently. Augustus ruled with restraint learned from chaos. He avoided excess. He rewarded loyalty. He restored temples and traditions, linking his authority to Rome's deepest values. Peace returned, not fragile, but enduring. Roads were repaired. Borders stabilized. Trade flourished. For the first time in generations, Romans slept without fearing tomorrow. Yet this peace came at a price. Political freedom narrowed. Dissent softened. Participation gave way to observation. The people gained stability, but lost influence. Many accepted the exchange willingly. Rome had chosen order. As Augustus aged, succession loomed. The question the Republic had never solved and the empire could not escape. The system now depended on the character of one man and those who followed him. Its strength and its vulnerability were the same. Still, in this moment, Rome stood renewed. The long struggle between shared power and singular authority had ended, not with resolution, but with transformation. The city that once swore never to accept kings now lived under an emperor, content to call him something else. The Republic had ended, not in flames, but in relief. And from its ashes rose an empire that would shape the world for centuries. Disciplined, confident, and forever marked by the choices that brought it into being. The peace Augustus left behind felt solid, almost permanent. Roads stretched farther than ever. Cities gleamed with new temples and public baths. Trade flowed steadily across the Mediterranean, carrying grain, wine, and stories of Rome's greatness. To many, it seemed the empire had finally discovered balance. But peace built on absolute power depends on who holds it. When Augustus died, Rome held its breath. The system he had created was stable, but not self-sustaining. It relied on succession, a dangerous uncertainty in a world that remembered too well the chaos of ambition. His chosen heir, Tiberius, inherited not only authority, but expectation. Tiberius ruled cautiously. He honored institutions, avoided spectacle, and governed from a distance. Yet suspicion followed him. Power without warmth bred unease. Accusations multiplied, informers thrived. The Senate, once dominant, now operated under watchful silence. Rome was learning that empire could be orderly and oppressive at the same time. After Tiberius came Caligula, and with him a sharp break in restraint. The young emperor ruled as if the empire existed to reflect his will alone. Wealth was spent recklessly. Fear became entertainment. Boundaries between public office and personal indulgence dissolved. Stories of madness spread, some exaggerated, others terrifyingly real. Senators learned that dignity offered no protection. The illusion of shared governance shattered openly. Power, once hidden behind tradition, now stood exposed. Caligula's death came swiftly, violently, and without mourning. The Senate hesitated, uncertain whether the empire could survive without an emperor at all. But the army decided otherwise. Claudius, unexpected and underestimated, was elevated by soldiers who understood where authority now resided. His reign reminded Rome that competence could exist even within absolute rule. Administration improved. Provinces were integrated. Law was applied with surprising fairness. Yet even good governance could not disguise the reality. The empire belonged to the emperor, and stability depended on his character. Under Nero, excess returned, quieter at first, then unmistakable. Art, performance, and spectacle consumed the ruler's attention. Power became personal theatre. When disaster struck, fire sweeping through Rome's crowded neighborhoods, blame followed fear. The gap between ruler and ruled widened dangerously. Rebellion erupted at the edges of the empire. Confidence wavered. Nero's fall ended the Julio-Claudian line and plunged Rome into another crisis of succession. In a single year, emperors rose and fell in rapid succession, each supported by different armies. The lesson was brutal and clear. The empire was no longer governed from Rome alone, but from wherever legions pledged loyalty. Power had become mobile, conditional, and expensive. Gold secured allegiance. Promises secured survival. Order returned under Vespasian, a practical soldier emperor who rebuilt both Rome and its confidence. He restored discipline, repaired finances, and reminded the empire that authority could be grounded in service rather than spectacle. But the nature of imperial power remained unchanged. Wealth poured into Rome from the provinces. Amphitheatres rose. Games grew grander. Blood flowed beneath cheering crowds. Entertainment became a language of control. Distraction, unity, and dominance fused into ritual. For the elite, life was precarious. Favour shifted quickly. A careless word could end a career or a life. For the masses, the empire offered security, food, and spectacle, enough, often, to dull concern for participation. The army stood at the centre of it all. Emperors rose through military support and fell through its withdrawal. Campaigns expanded borders and enriched commanders. Loyalty was rewarded with donatives, gifts of money that bound soldiers to rulers more tightly than ideology ever could. Absolute power demanded constant reinforcement. Religion, too, adapted. Emperors were honoured as divine or semi-divine figures, symbols of unity across diverse cultures. Worship of the emperor did not replace local gods, but stood alongside them. A reminder that loyalty to Rome was both civic and sacred. Yet beneath the gold and ceremony, tension remained. Succession was never guaranteed. Every transition carried risk. Every death invited calculation. The empire had achieved stability through dominance, but it lived with the constant possibility of fracture. At night, Rome glowed with torchlight and marble. Music drifted from villas. Guards patrolled streets that once echoed with political debate. The city was powerful, beautiful, and uneasy. The Republic had feared kings. The empire lived with emperors, capable of greatness, cruelty, or collapse in equal measure. Rome now commanded the known world, but its greatest challenge was no longer expansion. It was control, of ambition, of loyalty, of power itself. The age of absolute authority had arrived in full. It brought peace, prosperity, and splendor. It also carried blood in its wake, and a reminder etched deeply into Rome's story. When power is concentrated without limit, the empire may endure, but freedom does not. For a time, the empire exhaled. After generations of war, upheaval, and uncertainty, Rome entered a period that later ages would remember as its calmest and most confident. The borders held. The legions stood watch rather than marched endlessly. Trade moved freely along roads and sea routes secured by Roman authority. This was the age of the Pax Romana, a peace not born of harmony, but of unquestioned power. For ordinary people, life grew predictably structured. Dawn arrived with the sound of carts on stone roads. Markets opened beneath shaded colonnades. Bakers heated ovens before sunrise. In towns from Spain to Syria, the rhythms of daily life began to resemble one another. Rome had made the world familiar. Cities flourished. Aqueducts carried fresh water across valleys and into public fountains. Baths became centers of social life, places where rich and poor alike could rest, talk, and share warmth. Amphitheaters hosted games that drew entire populations into collective excitement. Temples stood beside administrative buildings, faith and governance intertwined. The empire invested in permanence. Stone replaced wood, streets were paved, laws were standardized, contracts were honored. Disputes could be settled not by force, but by appeal to Roman authority. For many provinces, Roman rule brought stability unknown before. Roads linked inland villages to coastal ports. Goods travelled farther, faster, and safer than ever. With stability came prosperity, uneven but widespread. Merchants thrived. Craftsmen found steady work. Farmers sold surplus into growing markets. Grain from Egypt fed Rome's vast population. Olive oil from Spain lit lamps across the empire. Wine flowed freely, binding distant regions through shared consumption. At the heart of this system stood the emperor, no longer feared for unpredictability, but respected for consistency. Under rulers like Trajan, Hadrian, and Antoninus Pius, imperial authority was exercised with restraint. These emperors travelled the provinces, listened to petitions, and invested in local infrastructure. They ruled not as distant gods, but as stewards of a vast inheritance. The Senate, though diminished, retained dignity. Local elites participated in governance. Rome's success depended on cooperation, not constant coercion. Yet this golden age was not without shadow. The peace that sustained it rested on legions stationed at distant frontiers. Soldiers guarded rivers and deserts, forests and mountains. Their presence discouraged invasion, but also reminded the empire of its dependence on force. War had not vanished. It had been pushed outward. Slavery remained deeply woven into the economy. Enslaved people worked mines, fields, and households. Their labor made leisure possible for others. Their suffering, largely invisible, underpinned prosperity. The empire's calm was selective. Citizenship expanded, gradually transforming identity itself. To be Roman no longer required living in Rome. It meant participating in a shared legal and cultural framework. Language, law, and custom spread, blending with local traditions. The empire did not erase difference, it absorbed it. At night, cities glowed softly with oil lamps. Conversations drifted from open windows. Children learned letters that tied them to a world larger than their hometown. News traveled slowly but steadily. Life felt ordered, understandable. For many, this was the best Rome would ever offer. Art and architecture reflected confidence. Statues celebrated idealized humanity. Buildings emphasized harmony and proportion. Public spaces invited participation. Even time itself was regulated. Calendars standardized. Festivals observed empire-wide. The emperor's image appeared everywhere, on coins, in temples, in law, not as a tyrant, but as a symbol of continuity. The empire needed reassurance that tomorrow would resemble today, and for decades it did. Yet beneath the surface, subtle pressures accumulated. The cost of maintaining borders rose. Succession, though smoother than before, remained uncertain. Prosperity bred expectation. Stability bred complacency. The empire had grown vast, perhaps too vast to remain perfectly balanced. In distant provinces, local issues simmered. On frontiers, enemies watched and learned. Within the economy, reliance on conquest gave way to reliance on taxation. Systems built for expansion adapted imperfectly to maintenance. Still, for those living in the moment, the future felt secure. Rome had achieved what once seemed impossible. Peace across continents, law across cultures, identity across distance. It had turned the Mediterranean into an inner sea, bound by roads, trade, and shared authority. The Golden Age did not feel fragile, it felt earned. And that was its quiet danger, because Rome had learned how to rule the world, but not yet how to change without breaking. The peace of this era rested on foundations laid by discipline and force, sustained by competence and habit. As long as those held, the empire shone. Soon, however, forces beyond Rome's control, economic strain, external pressure, and internal fracture, would test whether this golden calm was a lasting achievement or merely a pause before upheaval. For now, though, Rome rested beneath its own grandeur, confident in the order it had created, unaware that even the strongest structures must eventually face the strain of time. The change did not arrive with a single disaster. It came as a sequence of shocks, close enough together that recovery never fully took hold. For generations, Romans had believed the empire to be permanent, not eternal in theory, but stable enough to feel unquestionable in daily life. Then slowly at first, that certainty began to slip. The 3rd century opened with unease. Borders that had long held firm began to strain. Along the Rhine and Danube, new confederations of tribes tested Roman defences, probing for weakness rather than conquest. In the east, a revived Persian power challenged Rome with an organisation and ambition it had not faced in centuries. These enemies did not attack blindly. They learned, adapted, and waited. Inside the empire, trouble multiplied. The careful balance of the Golden Age depended on prosperity, and prosperity depended on security. As wars became more frequent and defensive, the costs of maintaining the army soared. Taxes increased. Coinage was debased. Inflation crept quietly into markets, shrinking purchasing power and confidence alike. Trust in money, in leadership, in the future began to fray. Then came the plagues. Illness moved faster than armies, carried along the same roads and trade routes that once symbolized unity. Cities emptied, fields went untended. Fear replaced routine. No one fully understood the cause, only the consequence. Death on a scale that weakened labor, reduced tax revenue, and shattered morale. The gods seemed distant. Rituals multiplied, but reassurance did not. At the center of the crisis stood the emperors, or rather, the rapid succession of them. In just a few decades, Rome saw rulers rise and fall with alarming speed. Many were soldiers elevated by their troops, proclaimed emperor on distant frontiers, then marched toward Rome to claim legitimacy. Few lasted long. Assassination became common. Usurpation became expected. Authority became provisional. Each new emperor promised restoration and stability. Each inherited a situation already beyond easy repair. The Senate, long sidelined, could offer little guidance. The army, once Rome's backbone, became fragmented by competing loyalties. Provinces, desperate for protection, sometimes turned inward, relying on local leaders rather than distant emperors. For the first time, the empire began to feel too large to hold. Entire regions broke away temporarily. In the west, a breakaway Gallic empire formed, claiming to preserve Roman order where Rome itself could not. In the east, local rulers asserted autonomy under the guise of loyalty. These were not rebellions born of ideology, but of survival. Rome's unity had become negotiable. Daily life reflected the instability. Cities reinforced walls. Travel became riskier. Long-distance trade declined. People relied more on local production, local authority, local networks. The interconnected world Rome had built began to contract. Yet the empire did not collapse. What sustained it was resilience forged over centuries. Bureaucracy continued to function, however strained. Soldiers still stood watch. Farmers still planted crops. Faith adapted, offering comfort when institutions failed. New religions gained followers, speaking to uncertainty and hope beyond earthly power. The empire, once confident in its traditions, now searched for meaning in a shifting world. Amid the chaos, some emperors proved capable. They fought invasions, reasserted borders, and restored fragments of order. Their successes were real, but temporary. Each gain was fragile, easily undone by the next crisis. The pace of change exhausted everyone. Rome had always survived through adaptation, but now adaptation felt constant and incomplete. There was no time to rest, no space to rebuild fully. Crisis fed crisis, each reinforcing the next. By mid-century, the empire teetered. Coinage was mistrusted, authority was fragmented, cities shrank, confidence evaporated. What had once been the center of the world now struggled to govern itself, let alone distant provinces. And yet, within this turmoil, the seeds of transformation were taking root. The crisis revealed what no period of peace could, which systems still worked, and which no longer did. Old assumptions about power, economy, and identity were stripped away. What remained was raw necessity. Rome was being forced to reinvent itself. The 3rd century did not end with resolution. but with realization. The empire could not continue as it had. The structures built for expansion and abundance were ill-suited for defense and scarcity. A new approach was required, more rigid, more centralized, more controlled. The world Rome had known was shaking, not to destroy itself entirely, but to demand change. As the century drew toward its close, the empire stood battered but unbroken, aware now that survival would require sacrifice, restructuring, and a willingness to abandon cherished traditions. The Golden Age was gone. In its place stood a harder reality. Rome had reached a turning point. What followed would determine not just whether the empire endured, but what kind of empire it would become. The Roman Empire did not survive the 3rd century by chance. When the chaos finally slowed, what remained was not the old world restored, but a world stripped to its essentials. The crisis had exposed every weakness, political, military, economic, and made clear that survival would require transformation, not nostalgia. That transformation began with Diocletian. When he rose to power, the empire was exhausted. Borders were unstable. Loyalty was fractured. Authority was questioned everywhere. Diocletian did not attempt to revive the gentler traditions of earlier emperors. Instead, he embraced structure, hierarchy, and control with unapologetic clarity. He ruled not as first among equals, but as an unmistakable master of the state. The empire was simply too vast, too complex to be governed by one man alone. Diocletian divided authority, creating the tetrarchy, a system of 2 senior emperors and 2 junior ones, each responsible for a portion of the empire. Power was shared, but rigidly defined. Succession was planned, not improvised. For the first time, Rome openly acknowledged that unity required administration rather than tradition. The state grew more formal, more visible, more demanding. Bureaucracy expanded. Taxes were reorganized and enforced more strictly. Professions became hereditary in practice, binding families to roles deemed essential for stability. Flexibility was sacrificed for predictability. Life became heavier, but safer. Diocletian also reshaped the image of rule. Emperors no longer presented themselves as approachable citizens. They wore elaborate garments, demanded ceremony, and cultivated distance. Authority was meant to inspire awe, not familiarity. Power was no longer hidden behind republican memory. It stood openly, commanding obedience. Religion followed this shift. The traditional gods were elevated as symbols of unity and continuity. Sacrifice and ritual were emphasized as acts of loyalty to the state itself. Those who refused participation were viewed not merely as dissenters, but as threats to cohesion. Persecution followed, harsh, systematic, and ultimately unsuccessful. The attempt to enforce religious uniformity revealed another truth. Belief could not be commanded as easily as labor or taxes. Faith, once private and diverse, had become deeply personal and quietly resistant. When Diocletian stepped down, voluntarily, a rarity in Roman history, he left behind a stabilized but rigid empire. The crisis had been halted, but not resolved. The system worked, but it lacked flexibility and warmth. Rome was secure, yet brittle. Into this world stepped Constantine. His rise was shaped by conflict, but his vision was shaped by opportunity. After defeating his rivals, Constantine emerged as sole ruler, not by dismantling Diocletian's reforms, but by reshaping them. He understood that authority required more than force. it required meaning. Constantine's embrace of Christianity marked one of the most profound shifts in Roman history. This was not an instant transformation. Pagan traditions remained strong, temples still stood, old rituals continued. But Christianity, once persecuted, was now protected, then favored. It offered something the empire desperately needed: a unifying belief system that transcended region, language, and class. Faith became a tool of cohesion. Constantine did not abandon imperial power. He sanctified it. The emperor was no longer merely ruler by strength or tradition, but by divine favor. Authority was reframed as sacred responsibility. Law and belief intertwined in new ways. The founding of Constantinople symbolized this transformation. Positioned between East and West, old and new, the city embodied Rome's evolution. It was Roman in law, Greek in culture, Christian in spirit. The center of gravity shifted eastward, towards stability and wealth. Rome itself remained important, but no longer indispensable. Daily life adjusted accordingly. Christianity spread through cities and countryside alike. Churches rose beside temples. Bishops gained influence as community leaders. Charity and care for the poor became visible expressions of faith. Identity expanded beyond citizenship into belief. Yet the empire did not become gentler overnight. Control remained strict. Hierarchy endured. Taxes were heavy. The army was ever present. The difference lay in justification. Power was no longer defended solely as necessity, but as part of a divine order. This change brought both comfort and conflict. Some welcomed the promise of eternal meaning. Others mourned the fading of ancient traditions. Debate replaced persecution, at least temporarily. The empire was learning to accommodate difference, unevenly, imperfectly, but sincerely. By the end of Constantine's reign, Rome was no longer the empire of Augustus. It was more centralized, more formal, more spiritual. The old republic was a distant memory. The golden age was gone. In its place stood a new Roman world, resilient, complex, and transformed. Reinvention had saved the empire, for now. But reinvention also changed its nature. Rome had traded flexibility for structure, tradition for doctrine, and shared memory for sacred authority. These choices would shape everything that followed. The empire had survived by becoming something new. Whether that new form could endure the pressures ahead was a question the future would soon answer. The Roman Empire did not split in a single moment. There was no proclamation, no final decree that divided the world in two. Instead, separation arrived gradually, shaped by geography, culture, and necessity. By the 4th century, it had become clear that the empire was no longer one seamless whole, but two distinct worlds sharing a name and a memory. In the West, Rome itself still carried immense symbolic weight. Its streets echoed with history. Its monuments spoke of conquest and confidence, yet behind the grandeur, decline was setting in. Population shrank, trade slowed. The old administrative systems struggled to function with reduced resources and constant pressure. In the East, things were different. Cities like Constantinople thrived. Commerce flowed through its harbours. Wealth accumulated. Bureaucracy operated with efficiency. The Eastern Empire, richer and more urbanized, adapted more easily to the demands of defense and governance. Greek culture blended seamlessly with Roman law, creating a flexible and resilient identity. Both halves claimed to be Rome. Both were right. The Western Empire faced challenges it could not fully control. Its borders were long and difficult to defend. Armies were stretched thin. Recruitment relied increasingly on federati, allied barbarian groups, settled within imperial territory in exchange for military service. These arrangements were pragmatic but unstable. Loyalty became complicated. As migrations intensified, entire peoples moved across frontiers, not as raiders, but as refugees seeking land and security. The empire struggled to integrate them. Agreements were made and broken. Violence flared unpredictably. Authority weakened with each compromise forced by necessity. The sack of Rome by foreign forces shocked the ancient world, not because of the damage inflicted, but because of what it symbolized. Rome, once unthinkable to violate, had become vulnerable. The psychological impact far exceeded the physical destruction. Yet the world did not end. Life continued. Administrators adapted. Churches provided stability where civic institutions faltered. Bishops became local leaders, mediating between populations and power. Faith offered continuity when imperial authority receded. The Eastern Empire watched carefully. While the West struggled, the East fortified its borders, refined its administration, and preserved economic stability. Emperors in Constantinople ruled with confidence. Law was codified. Trade networks remained intact. The city itself stood as a beacon of continuity. Roman in authority, Christian in identity. Still, the fate of the West could not be ignored. Attempts were made to restore order. Emperors rose and fell rapidly. Military strongmen held temporary control. Alliances shifted. Each effort postponed collapse without preventing it. The structures of the Western Empire slowly gave way, not to sudden destruction, but to gradual replacement. Roman authority faded into regional rule. Local leaders governed in Roman style, using Roman titles, laws, and customs. The empire dissolved into successor kingdoms that preserved fragments of its legacy. Roads were maintained. Latin endured. Law remained influential. Rome did not vanish, it transformed. In the East, the empire endured. Often called the Byzantine Empire by later historians, it considered itself fully Roman. Its emperors bore Roman titles. Its laws were Roman. Its people identified as Roman for centuries to come. What changed was emphasis. Survival over expansion, defense over conquest. The East learned from the West's collapse. Fortifications strengthened. Diplomacy became a weapon. Culture adapted without surrendering core identity. The empire bent where it could not resist. Meanwhile, in the West, memory replaced authority. Rome became an idea, a standard against which new powers measured themselves. Kings sought legitimacy through Roman forms. The church preserved texts, law, and learning. Monasteries became quiet guardians of continuity. Two empires had once shared the same world. Now they shared a fate defined by adaptation. One fell by losing the ability to sustain itself. The other survived by changing enough to endure. Both were shaped by the same pressures: migration, economy, belief, but responded differently. The division of the empire was not failure. It was evolution under strain. Rome had always been more than a city. It was a system, a culture, a way of ordering the world. That system could not remain uniform forever. Geography and time demanded variation. As the Western Empire faded into history and the Eastern Empire carried the Roman name forward, a profound truth became clear. Rome did not die all at once. It lived on, divided, transformed, remembered. And in that division lay the final chapter of one story and the beginning of many others. The end of Rome did not arrive as a single moment of darkness. There was no final sunset that extinguished the empire all at once. Instead, the Western Roman world faded gradually, like a lamp running low on oil, still giving light, even as its strength quietly diminished. By the 5th century, the Western Empire was no longer truly imperial. Emperors ruled briefly and often in name only. Real power rested with generals, regional leaders, and foreign allies who defended territory in exchange for land. Rome itself, once the heartbeat of the world, had become a symbol. Revered, remembered, but no longer commanding. When the last Western emperor was removed from power, few noticed. There were no riots in the streets, no universal sense of collapse. Life continued much as it had the day before. Farmers planted crops, bishops held services, local rulers governed as best they could. The machinery of empire had already been replaced piece by piece. Rome did not fall because it failed completely. It fell because it changed too much, too slowly, and then could not change enough. The structures that once made Rome strong, its roads, laws, military discipline, and administrative reach, had been designed for expansion. When expansion ended, those same structures became burdens. The cost of defense exceeded the wealth of the land. Loyalty fragmented. Authority became negotiable. And yet, Rome did not disappear. Its ideas proved stronger than its armies. Roman law endured, shaping justice long after emperors vanished. Latin evolved into new languages, carrying Roman thought into the future. Cities built on Roman foundations continued to thrive. Even the idea of empire, centralized authority, order through law, unity through governance, remained a powerful aspiration for centuries. The Church inherited much of Rome's role in the West. Bishops replaced governors. Dioceses mirrored old administrative borders. Where imperial authority faded, spiritual authority stepped forward. Rome's legacy was preserved not through conquest, but through continuity. In the East, the empire lived on. Centered in Constantinople, Roman rule adapted and endured for nearly 1,000 more years. Emperors there still called themselves Roman. Their laws were Roman. Their identity was Roman. What later generations would label the Byzantine Empire was, to its people, simply Rome. Refined, Christian, resilient. The Eastern Empire survived by learning lessons the West could not afford to ignore. It invested in diplomacy as much as warfare. It fortified cities. It preserved knowledge. It accepted transformation without surrendering identity. Even when Constantinople eventually fell, the Roman story did not end. Its scholars fled westward, carrying ancient texts that would ignite new eras of learning. Its laws influenced emerging states. Its vision of order continued to shape civilization. Rome's greatest legacy was not domination, but endurance. It taught the world how to organize power, how to administer vast territories, how to build institutions that could outlive individuals. It demonstrated both the promise and the danger of authority, how stability can bring peace, and how unchecked power can hollow a system from within. Rome was neither purely heroic nor purely cruel. It was human, ambitious, adaptive, resilient, flawed. Ordinary people lived entire lives under its shadow without ever seeing an emperor. They worked, loved, feared, and hoped much as people always have. Rome mattered to them not as an abstract idea, but as the structure that shaped their days, the roads they walked, the laws they followed, the faith they practiced. In that sense, Rome never truly ended. Its presence lingers in city plans, in legal language, in political thought, in architecture, in the very idea that a society can be ordered by reason rather than force alone. Every parliament, every legal code, every debate about citizenship echoes Roman questions asked long ago. Who should rule? How should power be limited? What binds a people together? Rome never solved these questions completely, but it asked them with unmatched seriousness and left behind answers that still shape the world. As the centuries passed, the ruins of Rome became quiet. Marble cracked, statues weathered, grass grew between stones, but memory remained alive, carried not by monuments, but by influence. Empires rose in imitation of Rome and fell in comparison to it. Kings sought its legitimacy. Revolutions borrowed its language. Scholars returned to its texts when seeking wisdom. Rome became eternal not because it lasted forever, but because it changed the meaning of lasting. It proved that civilizations do not end when governments fall. They end only when ideas are forgotten. And Rome's ideas endured. Now, as this long journey comes to rest, imagine the city at dusk, the same city that once ruled the world. The sun lowers behind ancient hills. Shadows stretch across broken columns. A breeze moves softly through arches that once echoed with power. The noise of empire is gone. What remains is quiet. Quiet enough to reflect, quiet enough to remember. Rome began as a story told beside a river. It became a force that shaped continents. And in the end, it returned to something gentler, a legacy carried not in conquest, but in memory. May this story linger with you as the night deepens. May the past rest softly, without weight. And may the long road of Rome fade into sleep, leaving only calm behind.